Hi everyone, welcome to Caspian Policy Center. This is our next webinar. It's a very interesting topic today we have. Hello everyone who's joining us from all over the world, from Washington as well. We have a very interesting topic today. We are also presenting our report at this webinar. It's about unlocking the renewable energy potential in the Caspian region. We have distinguished guests with us today as well, and I want to just start this and welcome everyone and then turn over to our moderator. The Greater Caspian region faces a rising demand for electricity from industrial, commercial, and individual consumers. Unreliable electrical supplies inhibit robust economic growth and present further challenges when attracting foreign direct investment. Today at the Caspian Policy Center, we are convening experts from renewable sector and financial institutions operating in the Caspian region to discuss the ways they can harness their vast hydro, solar, and wind power potential. Today's discussion will cover the potential for renewable energy in these four Caspian countries that still need to be done to attain national renewable energy goals. This event is held in conjunction with the release of the Caspian Policy Center's policy brief, which is called The Considerable Potential for Renewable Energy in the Caspian Region, that explores renewable power as a vital part of the Caspian's future energy and infrastructure plans. I know up to this day, perhaps, the discussions on the Caspian energy was more about hydrocarbons, oil and gas. Obviously, it was on the global stage as well. But I think gradually we are recognizing the potential of the renewable energy. And I hope this report will help us to understand, at least in four of the countries, to see where the major trends are, what can be done, what the potential is. With this, I will actually stop here and introduce our moderator, Dr. Robert Eichert, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Transformation, Energy Resources Bureau, U.S. Department of State. Dr. Eichert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ifgan. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thanks to the Caspian Policy Center for inviting me. Congratulations on the new report. I think it's very useful to get people interested in seeing the potential for renewable energy in the region, which is enormous.
Bob, I think you're muted.
Yeah?
No, we can hear him well.
Can you hear me? No? You're muted now. Okay, so yeah, it's a great pleasure to see you, Bob and Steve, my former colleagues at State and Aid. And let me make some introductory remarks before turning to Bob and Dante for the report summary. Well, yesterday we heard the IEA come out with their new World Energy Outlook for 2020. They have a number of scenarios for how to recover from the pandemic. But in all the scenarios, they see enormous growth in renewable energy. And particularly they were very bullish on solar, where we've seen the cost drop enormously over the last few years. Indeed, over the last decade, the growth of non-hydro renewables has been phenomenal. BP estimates about 13.7% annual growth over the 2008-2018 period. And of course, during the decade, we also saw the historic climate agreement in Paris, 2015, and also the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, particularly Goal 7 that, Bob, you know, I worked on at State for clean energy and renewable energy, energy efficiency, as well as energy access. So I think, you know, there's been a growing focus on this. Over half of the new power investments in the world are in renewables, and the IEA sees even larger percentage of future power investments in renewables in the future. Well, I think, and you know, from my perspective, obviously the transition is occurring in the Caspian region. Been a little slower than in some of the other regions, I think, because of the tremendous hydrocarbon and hydro resources that exist in the region. But it's picking up, and I think there's growing investment interest. And Zantos, I'm particularly interested in Kazakhstan, because obviously you've been a leader in this in terms of both the the current investment as well as your plans for the future. In September 2019, Kazakh officials met in Uzbekistan, issued the following statement, including officials from the Caucasus. Acknowledging the vast potential of renewable energy in the region and recognizing the solar and wind power have become attractive, cost-competitive options, we support the step-up of power production from these renewable sources. We commit to double up the current solar and wind power capacity in the region by 2023 and achieve a more diversified, cleaner energy mix. So clearly there's strong regional interest in this objective. Hydropower, of course, has historically played a key role in both of the sub-regions, accounting for in total, about 30% of total Caspian installed capacity is in hydro. And that capacity overall is about 66,000 megawatts in 2019. I've written and talked a lot about the importance of the energy-water nexus in the region. And I think this is one of the characteristics, and to both the economics as well as the politics of the region in terms of upstream, downstream relations, et cetera. One of the characteristics has certainly been the seasonality of hydro and the impact that it has on the need for thermal power and backup generation. And Steve, we see that, of course, in Georgia greatly. And also, I think as we look to the future, key issue, therefore, will be how can wind and solar, as we ramp up, be integrated into the grids of these countries so as to increase reliability and the flexibility of the system to deal with these seasonal and other dimensions, growing demand for energy, which, you know, is likely to be in the 4 or 5% range, as you've mentioned in the report. You know, I mean, capacity now is low in the region in terms of solar and wind, but in a sense, there are many projects underway that tap the abundant wind and solar resources, and investor interest and donor support is growing. And hopefully that will continue as they come out of the pandemic. And one of the key issues is clearly the need, therefore, to invest in not only the generation, but in the transmission and to improve the distribution system so that you have viable off-takers for the power at both the high transmission level as well as the distribution level. And so I think in our discussion today, I hope we can consider the key policy issues, regulatory issues, market issues, finance issues impacting this development, and focus in on the key question of how to create a more favorable enabling environment for such renewable energy investment. So I think I'll stop there and turn to you, Bob and Dante, to review the main findings and recommendations of the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very, very much. And it was actually a good intro and, you know, putting this in a broader context. When we first started working on this, the reason I wanted to try to build on this was having been involved years ago on the governing board of the International Energy Agency, having chaired the Standing Committee on Long-Term Trends. A lot of the work which we were doing in the International Energy Agency was focusing on how to look at energy security now. That's the way we had been traditionally looking at it in terms of oil supplies or gas supplies was really not adequate. And the world was changing, and demands were changing, and public expectations were changing. And so a lot of the work which we started, and which is actually coming out now in the new World Energy Outlook, was looking at the different sources of supply and coming really to realize, you know, how important renewables were. But I think a key thing in looking at the renewables was not just in terms of the greenness, which was sort of a focus of a lot of people in the West, but the changing increased efficiency, the lowering costs of these technologies, particularly solar and wind. And so looking now at the greater Caspian region, that whole stretch going from Turkey across through Afghanistan, what we're seeing there is a tremendous need for increased energy. We're seeing in many countries outdated energy infrastructure that needs to be upgraded to meet needs. And so what we were looking at and what we're suggesting, and what I think this report is really trying to do, is to reach out to policymakers and to also do, I think, to the business community, and talk to them about where renewables are today, particularly solar and wind. I mean, again, there's a long tradition of hydro, but with climate change and some other factors, hydro also has certain problems. But it's important that the utilities, the business communities, the governing governments, the public understand or have a better sense of what the options are, and really the tremendous opportunities for solar and wind in the region, as well as for hydro. The other point I think that they sort of came across here is, again, environmental factors are an increasingly important consideration within the region. Pollution is a real concern in many of the cities. There's concern about future water supplies and so forth. So again, the piece of the renewables can be an important part of this. Let me just sort of hit through on some of the key findings that we had here. And if you could just sort of put up that slide, it'd be great. The first of the sort of things which I really want to stress here is that governments in the region, authorities in the region, need to conduct full, detailed inventories of the hydro, solar, and wind resources there. There is a lot. And I think also studies that may have been done years ago may be outdated in terms of what the technologies are now. Looking at regulations and so forth, again, this is something that hydro, solar, wind should be considered. Second thing, sort of play to the local advantages in each country. Each country has its own particular condition. And Dante will talk more about this in a minute. But some countries in the region, Kazakhstan in particular, has unbelievable solar and wind capabilities. And Azerbaijan, others do have important capabilities as well. Hydro is also important in many of these countries. Third point I would want to sort of talk here is that in looking at the necessary upgrades to the power systems here, it's important to think regionally and to collaborate with neighbors. One of the things which we note is in many cases, important cities, Almaty, for example, are much closer to a neighbor than they are to their capital. And so the idea of sort of regional collaboration, regional cooperation in developing these new grids, in looking at the renewables and how they can fit in with these new grids really is important. And the cooperation is key here. Fourthly, include renewables in the discussions of modernizing existing transmission systems. One of the problems which we saw earlier on, and maybe this is out of date, and Bob Eichhorn and Dr. Burns can maybe talk a little, correct me on this, but one of the things which we've seen in other parts of the world is that it's not always easy to sort of plug in the solar and wind systems into existing systems. But if you're upgrading the transmission systems and the overall grids in these countries, and I know this is the case in a number of them, then this is a time to get this fixed, to sort of address these problems, to sort of take on the technical aspects here, sort of make solar and wind as much a normal piece of the transmission system as say coal or natural gas have been in the past. I'd also say there are a number of projects that have been on the board for a long time. It's important that governments follow through on them. And when the governments follow through on them, also tell the public that they're doing so. People don't necessarily realize where the power is coming from. And so this is, again, an important piece and can sort of help lay the basis for further progress later down the line. The other thing that I think is really important here is to recognize and to take advantage of the international support for renewable energy projects. This is something that I think is important for the business community as well as for governments. But the US Exim Bank, DFC, international financial institutions, all have programs which are there to help support the establishment of the utilization of these renewable resources. So with that, I'll turn this over to Dante.
Thank you, Ambassador Sakuda. I want to expand on your point that each country that we looked at has local advantages in regards to renewable energy. So the greater Caspian region as a whole holds tremendous wind, solar, and hydropower potential that can be harnessed to meet growing electricity needs. And energy consumption in Azerbaijan, Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan is only projected to increase. Therefore, the need to expand the availability of electricity supplies for growing business, industry, and private consumers is becoming more imperative. So the diverse geography of Central Asia and the South Caucasus place these countries in a unique position to choose between optimal renewable power sources. For example, Azerbaijan's location along the Caspian Sea provides optimal wind speeds and optimal hours of sunlight per year to generate substantial wind and solar energy. Azerbaijan's potential for wind energy stands at 26.2 terawatt hours per year, and its potential for solar energy is 202 per year. In Georgia, the mountainous terrain and abundance of river networks provide considerable opportunities for hydroelectric power. 319 of the 26,000 Georgian rivers are deemed suitable to produce as much as 135 terawatt hours of electricity annually. Kazakhstan's location along the steppes and its large geographical expanse provides suitable potential for wind and solar energy. Kazakhstan's solar energy potential is 32,930 terawatt hours annually, and its wind energy potential is 3,100 terawatt hours annually. And Uzbekistan is among the region's most renewable energy-rich countries, with a hydroelectric potential of 27.5 terawatt hours annually and a solar potential of 5,190 terawatt hours annually. And the governments in the Caspian region are realizing this tremendous opportunity to expand its use of renewable energy resources. Azerbaijan's government has committed to ensuring that 30% of its domestic power is generated using renewable energy sources by 2030. In addition, the Azerbaijani government has partnered with Saudi Arabia's ACWA Power and with Masdar in the UAE to construct solar panel and wind power facilities. And furthermore, Georgia's government is working with both domestic companies and foreign investors to finance its renewable energy ambitions. And similarly, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development helped finance about $9.1 billion in 262 energy projects in Kazakhstan by September 2019. Lastly, Uzbekistan rolled out new initiatives, including exemptions from property and profit taxes for companies that reach a set threshold of foreign investments to attract foreign companies in financing renewable energy projects to meet its 2030 goal of having renewable resources supply 25% of the country's electricity. While setting renewable energy benchmarks and attracting foreign investment have proved valuable in increasing renewable energy production in the greater Caspian region, these are just illustrative examples. There's much more that can be done, and the governments of the Caspian region are increasingly realizing their potential of renewable energy. Thank you. I want to turn it back to Dr. Eichord.
Thank you to both of you. And we're focusing on the four countries. It's important, Bob, as you said, though, to take a regional perspective in terms of the integrated grids and the trade, that potential between the countries too, that could greatly expand as you have more sources of diverse sources of power. Let's move now to our two other panelists, Dr. Steve Burns, my colleague, who's Chief of Energy and Infrastructure at USAID's Europe and Eurasia Bureau. Steve, why don't you go, and then we'll turn to Zantos after you.
Sure, and thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for the invitation to join the panel today, and my compliments to Ambassador Sakuda and the authors on what I think is a timely and well-written report. I maybe would just like to pull out a couple points to speak about in the report, and note how we at maybe at USAID are working in some of the same areas, and show that we I think would endorse some of the conclusions. I think, as you mentioned, just even setting aside the environmental benefits, if properly operated, renewable energy sources really have the potential to make power systems more resilient and lower cost. As you look, I think a lot of the conversation is about centralized generation still, but power systems as a whole are moving towards more distributed, localized generation, and renewables plays a very big role in that regard. The point I would really like to tease out there, and Dr. Icord referenced this a little bit at the start. It's not just about generation; it's about transmission and distribution as well. And, so when speaking to my colleagues in Europe, when we're engaged in this work, I like to compare the transition of modern power systems maybe to it would be equivalent in magnitude to the transition in transportation systems that occurred in the 20th century, right? Where we were moving from horse-drawn carriage to higher speed automobiles, right? There's going to be a very similar change in power systems, right? Just in terms of magnitude and in terms of how thinking needs to be done for system planning. Systems are going to have to be considered in a market and economic sense. Two-way power flows are going to need to be considered locally, right? So we're going to have to balance over larger areas. It just becomes a much more complex management task in the power system writ large. But that's an exciting opportunity. It really is, because again, it will, in spite of that complexity, lead to lower costs and more resilience. I mean, at USAID, again, my work is more in the Caucasus, so I can speak to a lot of the work we've done in Georgia to try to unlock some of that hydropower potential, both smaller scale and larger scale. And it's a perfect complement, right, to the neighbor in Azerbaijan, right, with its high wind speeds, with its high solar potential. The balancing capability between hydro and solar is just, they complement one another in a larger system. And so that speaks to I think the collaboration issue, the local advantages issue in the report. I mean, unfortunately, or not unfortunately, just as a matter of just technical need in a power system, right, you need to have backup capability. And so we found this in some of our smaller countries to be a limiter, and that's where the collaboration comes in handy. We were looking, and I know this isn't this region, but we looked in Southeast Europe with a lot of small, closely combined countries, that if we accelerated cross-border reserve sharing, backup power sharing by agreement and allowed per technical standard, we could rapidly increase the amount of renewables that could be integrated into the system, solely just based, on a regulatory issue, an allowance to share backup capacity across borders, right? So the potential is there. The other point I would make just quickly, because I know I don't have a lot of time, is that it's the don't think big issue that came out, right? There's a lot of smaller things that can be done, right, to really bring renewables into the system. I think, again, sitting in a donor agency, we like to count things. We like to think to big projects. We like to think to megawatts, right, as far as the amount of renewables that can be put into the system. But, right, the smaller transmission upgrades, the smaller distribution system upgrades, those are really important. And again, Ambassador Sakuda noted that, right, as we are modernizing the system, as we are upgrading the system, it's thinking to renewables as we take these steps. I think that's going to greatly accelerate how quickly renewable energy can be brought on board. So, I mean, I won't get into a laundry list of what USAID does. I could go point by point through the report, but I think that would take the rest of the hour. So with that, I would like to stop and turn it back to the other panelists. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Steve. And now we'll move to Zantos Magali, who's advisor to the chairman of Kazakh Invest. And obviously you're at the center of a lot of this in Kazakhstan, Zantos. I saw you have a webinar on auctions for renewable energy on October 22nd. So I'm sure you're busy preparing for that. So we welcome your comments.
It's very intense. We have the entire project office working on this sector. First of all, I would like to thank Caspian Policy Center for inviting me to this event, and congratulations on the new report. It's very valuable and timely. And in general, considering the climate conditions and vast natural resources, the potential of Central Asia in renewable energy production is enormous. However, for its development, it is very important to have a systematic policy of the governments in this direction. In particular, I can speak of Kazakhstan. The country has developed a state program for transition to green economy, which presumes an increase the share of the renewable energy in the total electricity production this year to 3%. By 2030 is 10%, and by 2050 it should reach 50%. Remarkably, renewable energy is one of the priority sectors, and our organization, Kazakh Invest, provides full support for RES projects. 97 renewable energy facilities are already operating with a total capacity of 1,260 megawatts. That includes solar power plants, wind, hydro, and bioelectric. Today, 19 projects worth 1.1 billion are being implemented in Kazakhstan. Of these, 9 projects are planned to be commissioned by the end of 2020. Overall, the last year was a very successful year. The capacities have doubled, and taking into account the facilities commissioned during the last year, in 2019, RES has already generated 2.4 billion kilowatts of green energy, with an increase of 78% compared to the same period of the previous year. So in general, 21 new projects in the renewable energy sector worth 613 million were implemented, with the capacity of more than 500 megawatts, which is doubled, as I was mentioning before. So how the country has achieved this pace and these results? First of all, it's legislation. In the period up to 2017, the country had fixed tariffs, which were replaced by the auction trading mechanism, with the introduction of the auctions with ready-made projects documentation. So in November 2019, the first auction was held, and as a result of which the competitive price for electricity was achieved. Today's auction is held on the open electronic trading system in accordance with the auction schedule, which is published on an annual basis on the website of the Ministry of Energy. So this schedule contains all the information on the auction, on the regions, on the power transmission organizations, the volume, etc. So RES in Kazakhstan is supported at the state level, and as I was mentioning, the legislation was crucial. We have the laws on supporting the use of the renewable energy sources, and the laws of the electric power industry, and other legal acts as well. So the legislation provides for a guaranteed centralized purchase and sale of the electric energy produced by RES facilities and carried out by a single purchaser. It is 15 years from the date of commissioning, and the general formula is 70 to 30. 70 is to convertible currencies, and 30% is consumer price index. So it's indexed. So recently, renewable energy sector was included in the list of priority activities, and we have provided various incentives such as exemptions from the customs duties, state in kind grants, tax preferences, and it's up to 10 or 8 years depending on whether it's new facility or expansion. So there is a huge preference support. In addition, we have for the small and medium-sized businesses, they can also receive funds for development of energy-saving technologies by UNDP, and with financial support from the Global Environment Facility. So there are various measures of support, and I would like to sum up with the thesis that the model that Kazakhstan developed could be the model for the entire region to develop this sector, and there are various funds available and international funding as well, as you were mentioning, EBRD, and we hope that American financial institutions such as DFC, Exim Bank could also cooperate in Kazakhstan with local and international entrepreneurs in order to get to the market. And also BDN, Blue Dot Network opportunities, which I believe perfectly suits with this sector, could also provide additional leverage in order to develop this sector. So that's in general, and I would like to ask for if you have any questions. I could provide more in detail informations. We have the American companies participating in the on our market as like General Electric in cooperation with ANI for a large project. So we hope more American companies could join our renewable energy system.
Thank you very much. That's incredibly interesting and important, I think, in terms of your leadership in the region, Zantos. I'd like to stay, I think, on, we now have questions coming in, and I encourage everybody to submit their questions, and we'll do the best we can to try to group them together. I'd like to stay on this issue of finance and incentives for a minute. One of the key elements is, as you said, there is substantial international interest and growing interest in the region in investment. I was wondering, how do you see Zantos or Steve in terms of experience, in terms of local bank and financial institution interest in this? Is most of the capital coming from abroad? And are the banks beginning to see the potential for investment in this area? I know in the small hydro, you've seen it for a number of years in Armenia and Azerbaijan, for instance. I mean, in Georgia. So how do you see that mix, and what is the government pursuing any policies to try to encourage local banks to become involved? Zantos, maybe you, and then Steve, and then Bob or Dante.
Yeah, as I was mentioning, there are various incentives provided by the government under the investment contract concluded with the investment committee of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, such as tax exemptions, as I was mentioning. Of course, there is a funding available locally. Let me remind you that there are more than 20 funds with government participation operating in Kazakhstan, and second-tier banks as well, private banks. And we will talk about, I believe we will talk about the international support as well, like the international funds. They are available, and there are various programs like the program developed by Fund Damu, which provides certain support for this industry for SME companies.
Steve, you know, and obviously you know about the Georgia funds for the development of renewables, and I think that when I was there last year, they said that they had mobilized funds for over 500 megawatts of mainly hydro, but they're working on solar and wind as well. You have any update on that in terms of how effective that model has been in terms of attracting private capital into this area?
Yeah, well, we're seeing the start of private capital coming in, I would say, unfortunately, and the region writ large. I think there's still a bit too much of a dependence on donor financing, you know, on lending facilities through local financial institutions and so on. Again, we're starting to see a fair number of private capital funds, but they're largely focused on smaller scale projects. and those projects that are being driven by central policy decisions. Maybe not the point at this point in the conversation, but we at AID would like to see, I think, a bit more of a market-based approach coming in, a little bit more third-party access and private capital into the sector. Again, I'm more Caucasus and Europe focused. I would appreciate the thoughts of what folks are seeing in Central Asia.
Bob or Dante, any comments?
Yeah, I think I'd like to sort of build on what Dr. Burns just said. I think my experience has been too that much of this is really sort of a still big project focus in terms of what's going on in many of the countries there. The other thing, which I think is a factor, and I saw in some of the countries where I was dealing, is that there's an overall need for reform of the power sector. There's a lot of talk about trying to privatize, but the system itself is still too stuck in the past. Some people might say Soviet, but it's really not. It's not really fair to say Soviet because I've seen this in other parts of the world as well. There's a need, I think, to sort of make the sector attractive to the private sector, make the power sector attractive to the private sector, and much of that. I mean, I still think of some countries where it's still a problem to get the public to pay for their electricity bills and things like that. And so there's a much bigger sort of set of factors that are involved there in terms of privatization. But I think one of the things which is important here, and I think I really appreciated what Mr. Timurgali was talking about in Kazakhstan. I think that kind of seeing what happens in different countries and the progress that can be made and the good results that come out of that work will be informative to other countries in the region. Because I think the countries in the region increasingly are paying attention to each other and what it is they're doing. But again, progress, I think, at least from what I've seen, has been a little slow on some of the private sector stuff. Needed, but still slow.
We have a question in that relates to the development of the industry and in the region in terms of the manufacturing capabilities that are potentially there. I mean, we've seen in Southeast Asia and other regions the growth of local manufacturing capabilities to supply those commodities at favorable prices and close to markets. Zandus, how are you seeing that in Kazakhstan? Because obviously you have the potential to I think your companies have the potential to manufacture at least certain components there and not have to import them.
Yeah, thank you for asking. First of all, manufacturing now for the advanced manufacturer, I would say, the intelligent manufacturer is one of the priority sectors fully supported by the government. And for this sector, we have the packet offer. So that includes the offer of the land plot, of the package of incentives, physical infrastructure, and comprehensive support. That's for the production, manufacturing. And another point that you mentioned, yes, the country has the various natural resources useful for the advanced manufacturer, such as rare earth metals, the nickel, lithium, cobalt, manganese, and other resources available locally. And we are happy to share this information with the international investors. That's the opportunity, and the country is ready to support and to develop already existing smart manufacturing.
Excellent. That raises the issue in my mind of the question of Chinese involvement in the region and this sector. I was looking at they've invested huge amounts in wind and solar, for instance, in Pakistan. I haven't seen as much in this region, although Steve, as you know, in Georgia, the Chinese have been involved in hydro development as they've had in Uzbekistan as well. And then also the issues related to the rare earths and the materials for solar in particular that China has tremendous role to play in terms of global markets. So, but anyway, it comments about the Chinese investment strategies in the region and how they're in this sector, and whether you're seeing them giving focus to solar and wind. Steve, you want to talk with the Caucasus?
Sure. I mean, I think we're seeing increased Chinese investment across all of the critical infrastructure sectors, right? It's an attractive option for countries that are looking to develop their economies. You've got lower cost capital. You have less of the restrictions that are coming out of the traditional Western financing sources, the IFIs and some of the donors. So it's something that I'd say, at least in my office, we're tracking and trying to find, alternatives that don't necessarily result in countries having to leverage some of their critical assets for, again, lower cost finance. Again, you see it a lot in energy. In Georgia, one of the things I would highlight as well is, some of the other or some of the traditional power projects are starting to run into localized opposition as well, some of the hydro projects. And so it becomes a convergence of circumstances where, some of the traditional larger projects that maybe we were banking on aren't necessarily going to come to fruition as easily or as quickly. And then you've got a lower cost finance option there. So it is definitely something I think we need to pay attention to moving into the future.
Thank you. We have a question that's a broader question related to the current situation where you have very, very low hydrocarbon prices. And of course, you have important role of gas and as a power sector source in the region as a complement to renewables, et cetera. And the question is, will these effects on the energy, what will the effects be on the renewable energy sector? And are they temporary? Are they likely to be long-term as an obstacle to investment in renewables, despite the lower prices for renewables? Any thoughts on this difficult question, Bob?
Yeah, this is a question, and I think it's not just for this for the Greater Caucasus region. It's a global question that's really being kicked around right now. There has been continued rise globally in terms of the installation construction of renewables, solar and wind particularly. I think one of the things that is a factor here. I mean, again, the costs. There's always going to be this question of cost comparativeness, and the declining costs of wind and solar, I think, are definitely factors here. One thing I think that is important to look at in terms of the countries in Central Asia and the Caucasus, particularly those that produce oil and gas now, there's a tendency in these countries to be looking at natural gas not just as not just to burn it locally, but to use it as a feedstock for new industries, increase the value added that comes from that commodity. With oil exports, there is the idea that if you're, let's see this in Saudi Arabia, don't burn it at home if you can sell it abroad. This is for these countries, this is an important foreign exchange earner. And particularly given the disruptions of COVID, where trade has gotten very complicated, whatever can be exported, that can earn that foreign exchange is going to be valuable. So the idea of exporting the oil and natural gas, whether as oil and natural gas itself or as a chemical product or something else, I think is something that's really catching in a number of the countries in the region as a benefit.
And we have a question in on that. Has your Caspian Policy Center examined the capacity of the Caspian region countries with oil and gas to increase their exports? So I don't know how much whether you're planning to do some more work on that issue or not.
No, I think that's an ongoing thing. I mean, one of the real issues for some of the oil and gas producers is the need for economic diversification. Just coming back a little more at the macro level, these are countries with, in many cases, 2/3 or more of the population were born 1990 or later. They have, they're young countries, they're countries with educated workforces, and they're countries with employment problems. And so the need to create jobs at home is key. One thing which we didn't really talk about here, but we talk a little bit about in the report, is the potential for renewables to actually help create jobs. Because if we get back to some of these things, the installation, we've seen this in the US, the installation of solar systems and so forth, all of those are new jobs. They're often, at least in the United States, been jobs for SMEs, for small and medium enterprises. So this is something else which is out there. And I think, we come back to this other point, sort of the retrofitting. The housing stock in many of these countries is old. And so and inefficient in terms of energy use. So looking at ways that renewables can be used to address an individual's own, individual family's own, or individual company's own energy needs is something I think that is important, and is an area for policy consideration, as well as an area for commercial engagement.
Right. Yeah, thank you for raising that. I was going to turn to that in light of the urbanization issues and the critical role of buildings in the future as these economies grow. And Steve, your point too about the nature of the electricity systems moving to more decentralized forms and more resilience and mini grids, et cetera. I think that, to my mind, in looking at a number of regions, this issue, not only the issue of rooftop solar and its integration with grid-connected buildings, but also the issue of the role that mini grids based on clean energy sources can play in industrial zones is becoming very much of an interest, especially in other parts of Asia. And I was wondering, Zhandos, do you have any thoughts on that in looking at Kazakhstan's broader economic patterns about the potential for more decentralized mini grid applications in industrial zones where companies are coming in and setting up facilities?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, I would like to comment on the previous speaker. In general, this huge movement of this huge shift of the electric system to renewables was, of course, the strategic, because currently in our energy system we have the surplus, and so we plan, as you correctly mentioned, that yes, it needs to be partially, it's outdated and it needs to be replaced and modernized. And of course, if you plan for 10 or 30 years ahead, yeah, you have to be really thinking about the potential and how this power system will be replaced by the renewables. So it is a strategic goal. Well, talking about the industrial zones policy, we expect, and we even can observe it, that we're moving towards the private industrial zones. So as you know, there are 13 special economic zones with a special tax regime, and 24 industrial zones in Kazakhstan with the plug-and-play infrastructure. And now the regions of Kazakhstan are moving towards the private, including the private under the foreign management industrial zones. And this, this is the new wave of the development of the regions.
Right. No, that's very interesting, and it parallels what's happening in several other countries that have established these special zones and are looking at how can solar and other technologies play in that regard. So Bob, you want to come?
One thing I'd like to ask, and this kind of comes from my experience working in Afghanistan, which is obviously sort of the most extreme case of many things, is how these sorts of systems can be used in rural areas. In many cases, Dr. Burns probably has a good experience of this, and I know Bob, you do as well. How these systems can actually be used to sort of help people in rural parts of these countries. In many cases, these are, Kazakhstan is huge, but even some of the smaller ones in the Caucasus, rural areas can be far away from the grid, or basically are still working off a very primitive form of the grid, a very old, outdated, maybe is a better term, form of the grid. They need power as well, and there's a lot of focus in some of these governments on rural development. And I think, this, my hunch, and some of the things I've seen, and certainly, micro systems for hydropower, for example, but I think also solar and wind may be a factor here to sort of helping meet some of those local needs in parts of the country, parts of these countries, which are, to maybe use an American term, disadvantaged in terms of what they have. I don't know, Dr. Burns, Bob, you're yards ahead of me on this.
Steve, you want to take a shot? I have lots of thoughts on it.
Yeah. Well, I as do I. I'll maybe limit to one. It's just, it is a good option for more disadvantaged regions or those that are more remote from the power grid. It does introduce a maintenance concern, right, as well. But in a way, that goes back to the jobs point you were making, right? In a way, it introduces a new industry, if you will, to the local economy. I think that's something we've tried to marry up in some of our development work, right? Where it's more off-grid power, but then at the same time, it becomes somewhat of a smaller scale jobs program as well, right? Training technicians to go out and maintain and install the particular microsystems. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, the Caspian region is a little different because you've got such high levels of centralized electricity access. But nevertheless, you're seeing, I think, adoption of home solar systems for electrical use because they've become much cheaper and more reliable in some cases than the grid. So I mean, certainly in Georgia and Armenia, we've seen that. And obviously, the nature of the dispersed populations in some of Central Asia and Uzbekistan and other places, it seems to me that would be unnatural to market. Now, the question goes back to my question: is there company business models that can see that as really being able to meet that demand and provide local financing, as we've seen in parts of Asia, like in Bangladesh or in Africa, where you've had companies willing to take on that risk of trying to develop these systems that are not only meet lighting needs, but also, in a sense, broader productive needs. And I'm thinking too about that, at least in some parts of Central Asia, you have the requirements for irrigation pumping. And so there's more and more efforts to try with the cost reductions to put in microgrids or mini grids that can provide power for productive uses for, grain grinding or for irrigation pumping as well as for lighting. And I think that improves the economics and the model if you can develop those kinds of decentralized system approaches. Okay. I think the issue, Bob, you raised the issue of finance viability, and I think I don't want to leave without at least touching briefly on that issue of pricing policy and incentives to try to improve the financial viability of the system in terms both the distribution transmission systems, because without that financing, the investments will be difficult to meet the needs of the growing renewable growth. Because a lot of the renewables are not only connected to the high voltage level, but also to the distribution companies. So I think from that standpoint, the comment in question is really what reforms and are needed to try to improve the financial viability, particularly on the distribution side, so that you can have a better off-taker for the renewable energy systems at that level. It's a tough question, and maybe we don't have that much time to deal with it, but any quick comments on that problem and how to overcome it?
Well, I will just say, as a former ambassador, I would turn to my USAID mission director and yell, "Help me!" And I'm looking at Stephen, hoping he will jump in on this. But I think, one of the things it kind of gets at, and we sort of dance around a little bit about this in the report because it's not always terribly convenient. There's a problem of old think. There's a problem of you do it the way you did it before. And I think, it's not just in this, the Caucasus, it's in New York. We, have a tendency to do what we did. And so it's breaking that mold, and saying like, okay, this is time. And who knows, maybe COVID's can be a sort of a blessing that way. And as we sort of break we have a lot of molds already broken, so we can build in new ways. But I think one of the things which I found is there's sort of a need for policy change to sort of push the reforms to open it up to private sector. There's also just a kind of getting this point across, sort of breaking the sort of the ongoing way of thinking in bureaucracies. And these are, they're bureaucracies in governments, but they're bureaucracies in power sectors, and their vested interests. And sort of taking on those vested interests is not an easy thing. But I will. Yeah.
So I'm going to end this discussion right now and turn it to Ifgan, but we have the final question that came in. It's how is COVID affecting renewables? So obviously that's a big issue, and hopefully we'll all recover and be able to see the continued growth of renewables in the future. So with that, I want to thank everybody for your interventions and good discussion here, and turn it back to Ifgan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Eichert. Once again, I'd like to thank the authors, Sekuda and also Dante, for putting a very interesting report together. I know it's just the start of the discussion on the Caspian renewables. We covered 4 countries, and we look forward to expand this study and look into more avenues and where renewable energy potential is. And obviously, I'd like to thank Dr. Burns for joining this discussion, and as well as Jandos from Kazakhstan for contributing to the discussion. Obviously, Kazakhstan has a great potential as well. I'd like to thank our CPC team for working hard to put this event together. Please check our website. We have the report posted on the website. You can read the full text. Stay tuned with Caspian Policy Center. We have more exciting events coming up in coming weeks. You can sign up to our newsletters and our emailing list to receive more information about the future events. Once again, thanks everyone, and thanks for joining this event.